Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson, contained in the Johnson edition. We turn now to poem 383, Exhilaration is Within. And now here in some ways we're back to poem 214. You'll remember I taste a liquor never brewed. And in some ways we're dealing now with Emily's question about where true joy resides. Is it external? Is it internal? Is it that quest for some kind of Scooby Snacks external, or is it rather, as she will call it, within? Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you've worked through our set of introductory comments. Guys, I'm really hopeful that you can place this poem within the context of the preceding 382 poems we just finished with 382 for death, or rather. Now, here, in some ways you could argue, Emily's attempt is to try to understand or value the highest spiritual, emotional status. That is to say, her word here is exhilaration. She'll use it one other time in poem 1118, and we'll read that when we get done here. Exhilaration is within. There can no outer wine so royally intoxicate as that diviner brand the soul achieves herself. To drink or set away for visitor or sacrament, 'tis not of holiday to stimulate a man who hath the ample wine within his closet. Best you can exhale in offering. Now, the idea of exhilaration, the notion of being completely overwhelmed and subsumed with a certain kind of joy-filled feeling. We often talk about it in room 303 as Scooby Snacks. She'll say exhilaration is within. This takes us back to poem 39, within my bosom. This idea of inside versus outside, internal versus external. Exhilaration is within, and then she'll say there can no outer wine, again taking us back to poem 214, that's that liquor never brewed. Outer wine so royally intoxicate. By the way, intoxicate only gets used once in all our poetry readings here. As, again, we're back to comparisons, that diviner brand, her use of the word divine we've seen already, as that diviner brand, the soul achieves herself, that is to say from within, to drink or set away for visitor or sacrament. Some have seen this as sacrilegious, that she'll say it this way, 'tis not of holiday. And this "tis not of holiday" is almost like the starting of a new sentence or a new thought, right? To stimulate a man who hath, again, stimulation, to exhilarate, stimulate, who hath the ample wine. You'll remember her use of this word wine from 123 and 214, within his closet. Now, the idea of being within the closet will take us obviously to the Sermon on the Mount of Christ and the idea of learning how to pray within your closet as opposed to public. And I think that's the point that Emily's actually shooting for here. In other words, I think she's talking primarily about herself as poet. And I think she's thinking about what it's like to have some kind of public recognition versus the private recognition, that which is within. And that is going to allow one to exhale in offering. The best, in other words, she uses that word best you can exhale in offering when you are in your own closet. I think this is Emily's attempt to try to convince herself that there is nothing that's more exhilarating than accepting one's own poetic genius on one's own terms. Now, when she gets to poem, when we get to poem 1118, she will say it this way: exhilaration is the breeze that lifts us from the ground and leaves us in another place whose statement is not found, returns us not, but after time we soberly descend a little newer, for the term, upon enchanted ground. Now, at 2a, what's the argument that she's making here? I think her argument is that the greatest wine, the greatest exhilaration, is the inner wine, the spiritual, the creative intoxication, if you will, as opposed to maybe like public recognition and fame. At 3b, note the strange feeling of intoxication that she'll play with here, rhetorically speaking. And she'll give us some, for example, the meter, notice it's a kind of odd mix. The stanza is composed in a common measure. Stanza 1 is. Stanza 2 and 3 are in short measure. Notice the slant rhyme. Did you see it? Of wine and brand, and last, Rhine and offering. That will almost sustain a sense of intoxication that some scholars have pointed out. And then, of course, you have echoes of alliteration in soul, in set, in sacrament, in stimulate, and obviously her love of sibilants. At 3a, well, we've mentioned poem 1118, and obviously we'll come back to it when we'll come back to this poem when we do that poem. Emily wrote this in a letter, though, and it's maybe one of her most famous lines about what is great poetry. I would argue this is her definition of exhilaration. Quote, "If I read a book and it makes my whole body so cold no fire can ever warm me, I know that is poetry. If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. These are the only ways I know it. Is there any other way?" End quote. Well, this brings us, of course, to how do you own a poem like this at 3b. Do you agree that the greatest intoxicant is, in fact, creativity? I know a good number of you have said, studying these poems makes me want to write poetry more. Emily would say, good for you. Hurrah. Thank you.